everybody. I'm Steve, and apparently a little feedbacky, sorry. So this is a talk called Functional Reactive Programming with Cappuccino. As you just found, for those of you who were in the room a minute ago, I wrote a Ruby gem called Frappuccino. But to get a little meta, I'm going to talk about what I'm going to talk about. Basically, the gem is actually like at the end. So this talk is actually largely not about Frappuccino, but it also is at the same time. So first of all, as was just mentioned, I teach classes with Jumpstart Lab. We do the best Ruby and Rails training in the world. So if you would like your team to level up, please give us a call. It's the only reason I can be here. It's the only reason that I can do all the open source work that I do. So yeah, Jumpstart, super awesome. Jeff's a great guy. This conference is a really special conference to me, and I missed it last year, but it's very special because this is actually the first Ruby conference I ever spoke at, way back in the day when I was first starting. So Adam Stakowiak and Win Netherland found out that I was going to be speaking at RubyConf in the fall, and they said, hey, Steve, we want you to come speak at our conference, so do that first. And so I came and spoke about Choose a very long time ago. So so this conference will always be very special to me. So thank you for having me here, and it's great to be back up on the stage again. This is important. So thanks. All right, so now the actual meta of going to be talking what I'm going to talk about. Let's talk about what I'm going to talk about, and then I'll talk about it, and then I'll talk about the stuff I want to talk about. So this talk is nominally about a Ruby gem called Frappuccino. However, there's a bunch of stuff that I realized while building this Ruby gem, and this talk is actually more about the implications of what this Ruby gem and what it means to me and what it should mean to you, even though you've not heard of this gem or probably installed it at all. So Frappuccino came born out of this thing where I like to joke that Aaron Patterson wrote a gist, and then I turned it into this life philosophy called Irresponsible Ruby. So we're going to talk about responsibleness and irresponsibleness and Ruby programming and sort of what all of that means. But one of the biggest things that I really want to make in this talk is that this talk specifically is a little interesting and a little weird and a little off-putting because I think that one of the weird things about me being up here on stage and you all being out there listening to me is that when we give presentations at conferences, you actually tend to see the end result of months of work, right? So imagine how much work Sandy put into that keynote this morning, right? So you see the end result of all of that effort, and you did not see all of the research and the trial and error. When someone talks about the code they wrote, like when I talk about my Ruby gem, you don't see all the hours of debugging and banging your head off the wall in frustration. You see the wonderful, perfect, majestic code that came out of it. And so there's this uncomfortable tendency whenever you see your favorite programmers come and speak on stage that you don't see all of the hard work and struggles that they put into making code, and therefore they appear perfect when we are very much not. I remember when, before Aaron Patterson was a friend of mine, when I thought he was untouchable, right? Because he was amazing and perfect, and now we're all just people. So I really don't want us to continue to have a celebrity culture as programmers. I was pair programming remotely with someone when Avdi did the pair with me hashtag. If you haven't seen that, remote pair programming is a thing. I was working with someone on a rescue issue, and we had written a test and it was failing, so we were trying to fix it, and we were working to make it pass, and the code didn't work. And we tried to make it pass, and the code didn't work. And we tried to make it pass, and the code didn't work. And the person said to me, hey, I'm really sorry about this. This must be really boring for you. And I was I don't know what you think I do all day, but my code doesn't work most of the time, right? So it's really important to obviously to give each other the respect that we deserve, but this talk specifically is, again, a little off, a little weird, a little unpolished. I will be doing live coding in 2 different versions of Ruby. And this is, if you didn't notice, this presentation software is a little odd. This is actually Rabbit, which is what a lot of the Japanese Rubyists present in. You can actually see that so it's got slide numbers on the bottom, and then the tortoise moves. So I told it how long the talk is, and it will end at the ending, so you can see where the rabbit ends up. And so anyway, so all of this is a little unfinished, but on purpose, because I wanted to present that kind of thing to you, as opposed to here's my perfection. So let's all have some fun for the rest of this talk. Plus, it's the end of the day on Friday. Why should we be serious? That's kind of ridiculous, right? Okay, so Irresponsible Ruby. I already touched on this a little bit, but what is Irresponsible Ruby? When I say Irresponsible Ruby, what do I mean? The short answer is Ruby code that you would not deploy at your day job because it is just too interesting or creative. And so I've come up with 4 criteria, maybe it's 5, 4 or 5 criteria for what specifically I mean by this. So this is like the one-sentence description. What would the rest of this be? So this consists mostly of neat hacks, weird metaprogramming, generally unusual techniques, and absolutely no unit tests whatsoever. Now, I say unit tests specifically for a reason. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this more in a minute, but basically, I mean no unit tests as in TDD, as in tests guide the design of my code. I think that when you're trying to be in this irresponsible mode, having integration tests or acceptance tests is really useful to verify that you didn't break stuff while you're doing it. But TDD, and the reason that we do it, is to guide us down a certain path. And so I don't want us to be guided down a certain path by our tests. So I say unit tests with very specific reasoning here. So that's yes. This is the crux of Irresponsible Ruby. Now, the person that most embodies Irresponsible Ruby is this guy. And for the benefit of all the people, so we just had raise your hand. I hate raise your hand stuff, but I'm going to do it anyway. So we just had who is on their first Rails job right now. For the benefit of all the people who've been around for a while, this is an experiment, something I've been talking about, people have been surprised about. Who does not know who this guy is? Right. So that's awesome. It's not awesome, but it's also kind of awesome. So this is a man named Y the Lucky Stiff. He is someone who was a very prominent member of the Ruby community and then decided to commit info suicide and leave. But one of the funny things about Y is that because we all think of it as being something that happened a little while ago, but the Ruby world has grown so much and we have so many new friends now with us that when someone leaves and they're no longer around, their legacy does not always carry on. So I'm sure that the people who did not raise their hand are like, what, seriously, this many people don't know who Y is? But I've been joking that I'm going to have to stop talking about Y pretty soon because as we get more and more and more new people, they're not going to know what I'm talking about. So for the benefit of all of you who did raise your hand, this is Y. I like to define Y as an artist whose medium was software, and he developed a whole lot of really interesting, really complex, neat, irresponsible Ruby code, and then he left. And one of the things that got me, one of the reasons that I am on this stage today and why I was on the stage 2 years ago actually, is because I decided that Y's projects were so important that I didn't want them to die even though he did. Effectively. The man that is depicted in this photo is alive and well, but Y, the character, the persona, is gone. So, and that's actually what I came to talk about 2 years ago. That's what I'm up here again. As you can tell, it's obviously it's weird when you take someone else's life's work and make it your life's work. So this is a person who I never met, who I obviously care a lot about. So anyway, so Y embodied this spirit. And it's funny because as I said, I basically took over a lot of his projects. So Hackety Hack and Shoes were mentioned. We'll talk more about shoes later. But since when you take over a project that has an absent creator, and that creator has been very irresponsible, it sucks. It sucks a lot. So if those of you who are in here for Brian's talk on code quality, this talk is sort of in many ways the anti-code quality talk, sort of. But it's very difficult whenever you've been creative to maintain things into the future. And so a while after Y disappeared, someone decided to write this blog post called A Letter from Y. And they had realized oh hey, Y's been gone for a little while, and I wrote him an email one time, and I got this really great response back. And so I want to share it with all of you. So he posted it to his blog. So if you Google for this, you can find the whole text, but I'm going to share with you the most important part of what Y said. So this person emailed Y and they said, Y, I love your work. What do I need to do to be an amazing programmer? How can I get there? What can I do to be like you? This is what Y had to say. I do not write tests for my code. I do not write very many comments. I change styles very frequently. And most of all, I shun the predominant styles of coding because that would go against the very essence of experimentation. In short, all I do is muck around. I admire programmers who take risks. They aren't afraid to write dangerous or crappy code. Insert irresponsible. If you worry too much about being clean and tidy, you cannot push the boundaries. Until an asteroid, why? It's just like, this is like the most thing that I can communicate Y's personality to you is this line. If you Google that blog post and you read it and you scroll down on the screen, there's a discuss thread at the bottom of that blog post. And at the top of that discuss thread, you will find a certain individual who looks familiar saying this. As someone who maintains Y's code these days, please write some tests. So to give you an idea of the kind of effort that I had to put into Hackety Shoes, I happened to purchase a new MacBook right around the time that Snow Leopard came out. For those of you that have been around the Mac for a while, you'll remember that Snow Leopard was the first release that Apple removed their deprecated Carbon framework. Carbon was the framework that they used to transition applications from Mac OS 9 to Mac OS 10. And so previously, before that, they'd left it in and said, it's going to be going away in the next release. It's going to be going away in the next release. So I had this new Mac, which had the first release where that was gone. Guess what? Y wrote his stuff using Carbon, and he decided to bail before he finished porting things over to Cocoa. So it actually took me 6 months of work before I could even compile the project on my machine. So Y was very irresponsible, and I was very frustrated. And that was just the Mac part. The Windows part was even more ridiculous because the same sort of deal. He had written it for Windows XP. Windows Vista was the one Windows that was out now, and I'm sure that you know how we all feel about Windows Vista. I simultaneously both hate and don't hate Windows more all the time. But that's something for a Ruby parlay thread. So I wrote this thing, and so now you're like, Steve, now you're up here on stage saying like the opposite of what you said 2 years ago. Why is that? So basically, I think that actually in the end, both of us were right, which may sort of sound like a cop-out answer, but I think the important part here is context. So I had sort of been saying for a long time that I thought that Y the Lucky Stiff was a great programmer, but that he was like, his code was kind of bad, but that was the point. And so my understanding was that it was like, I'm trying to create engineered, good, quality code, and that was something that Y was not trying to do, and so we're just different. And so I think that that's sort of almost the right thing. Basically, I think that there's certain times to be irresponsible and certain times to not be irresponsible. So we as programmers build stuff. We're builders. We make things. This is actually what I like most about programmers is that we like do things. And actually, so before I was a professional programmer, I worked in pizza. And as much as I hated being open past when the bars closed so that people could order more pizza from me at 3 o'clock in the morning, I really, really enjoyed making pizza with my hands. And I've always enjoyed building stuff. Now I just do it with this instead of with these. So we think a lot about the ways in which we build stuff. Like a lot of the stuff that we do is focused around the act of building and how we build things, right? So half of the talks here will be about development methodologies and like the way that you can apply them to your software, TDD, BDD, DDD, every letter, DD, all these things that we care a lot about, and we talk a lot about them, and we blog about them. People talk about how Ruby people are sort of test obsessed. We are all like bought into Agile really heavily, right? We care a lot about these processes around how we build things. But there's this thing called linguistic relativity. And if you're like me and you've read the Wikipedia page on the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, you'll know that Sapir and Whorf both did not actually work together and did not produce a hypothesis. So you actually should call it linguistic relativity. That's the extent of my knowledge of the details of that history. But if you've heard of that previously, Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, actually called linguistic relativity, there's two forms of this sort of concept. The strong form and the weak form. So the general idea is that language influences the way that we think and the things that we do. So the weak form says that language influences what we do and what we think. The strong form says that language determines what we do and what we think. So again, according to the Wikipedia page that I read thoroughly, not any of the literature linked at the bottom, but the Wikipedia page that I read thoroughly, there's evidence to demonstrate that the weak form of the hypothesis is accurate, but the strong form is not. So what this means is that language, to a certain degree, influences our reality. Now, The problem is that if we have these two different ways of thinking, and the way that we think and talk about stuff shapes the way that we do things, and we build stuff by doing things, then the way that we talk about designing software ends up influencing the way we build software. So sort of what I posit to you is that we need to take into account the fact that we need these two different modes of building things. We need a responsible mode, and we need an irresponsible mode. And the reason that we need the two different modes is because there are certain programs that you cannot TDD effectively. It's just true. There exists a series of programs of which TDD cannot get you there. And so we sort of if we say TDD is the only way to build software, it's the only way to do quality software, then we are leaving out possibilities for things. Now, I love TDD and I love testing, and I spend lots of time on this too, but I think that it's important that, engineering is great and all, but engineering is largely about refinement. And one of the tricky things about refining ideas is that they tend to make you go towards local maximums rather than global maximums. And in order to achieve global maximums, you need a revolution, and you need to break out of the way of thinking completely and go on to something entirely different. And then you can refine that to make it even better and even better. But without this sort of creative streak, without that spark of inspiration, you're not going to break out of that local maximum, right? This is the problem with A/B testing too, is that you can refine the design that you have a lot, but you get stuck in these local maxima. So I think we need to acknowledge and embrace and make a conscious decision about when to be responsible, but then also make sure that we are being equally irresponsible. And one of the things that I fear in the Ruby world is that in the last couple of years, we have developed a whole lot of stuff towards responsible mode and not a whole lot of stuff towards irresponsible mode. And so I would like to see you all be way more irresponsible, not when you're at work. And that's the important part. Jim Weirich gave a talk right before mine the one time, and so I stole his term for this. But basically, I sort of call this other mode exploratory mode. So if TDD is the way that we're responsible, or any of our other programming practices, then exploring the possibility space is is what irresponsibleness means. So the original Irresponsible Ruby code is a gist you can see on Aaron's GitHub. Basically, what it does is it's object.classEquals. Did you guys see this gist? So basically, it uses this library that's in the Ruby standard library called Fiddle. Fiddle allows you to manipulate pointers in Ruby. So what object.classEquals does is it gives you a method named classEquals. So you can say, for example, O equals object.new, O.class equals string, and then IRB will print out quote, 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 quote. You can do O equals object.new, O.class equals class.new do def lol puts lol end O.lol, and it will actually call the code. The way that Aaron made this work is by when you pass in the class, it actually goes and it finds the location in memory where that class object is stored, and then it goes into the object you're calling it on's the C level header where it points to where the class object of that object is, and then just swaps the pointers. And turns out that just works. So he made this, and it's in a module called I'm a horrible person, and then mixes that into object. And so I saw that and I thought that was great. And so that's exploratory, right? He's like, I want to see more about how Ruby object headers. I wonder if I can manipulate those at the bit level. Turns out you can. Turns out it works. But he could not have TDD'd that, right? So we have this really wacky, silly gift that if you deployed it in production, I would quit. But we have it, right? And it's awesome. So that's what's important about all of this stuff. So we need both of these things. Before I talk about my latest irresponsible project, which if you hadn't gathered is Frappuccino and FRP, I want to talk briefly about shoes. So when I came here 2 years ago, my talk was specifically about how I had taken over shoes and what I had done with it. And for those of you who do not know, shoes is a way of building GUI applications in Ruby, so desktop apps. And this is this is LoneStarRuby, not LoneStarRails, right? So while we all use Rails a lot, and I use Rails as much as everyone else does, there's a whole lot more to Ruby than Rails. And so shoes is a way that you can build desktop applications, which I know are going out of fashion. It's like really ridiculous to me that on this, I want to use a web browser, but on this, I want to use a native installed application. Like it just seems like totally weird to me. So I would like to see us build more desktop applications in Ruby. Yeah, lots of complicated feels about that. Like if we need world-class desktop quality applications in the browser, why can't we just have world-class desktop quality applications on our desktop where those things exist? Anyway, so shoes is a way that you can build desktop apps in Ruby. And as I told you before, shoes was coded in an extremely irresponsible manner. There's a file in the shoes source that is called ruby.c. And there's a comment at the top of that file written by Y that says, just a few little bits of Ruby that I've become accustomed to, followed by about 2,500 lines of uncommented C code. After one of the other things that was almost done but not finished when Y left was porting shoes from Ruby 1.8.7 to Ruby 1.9.1. And Ruby 1.9.1 had just come out, and as Rubyists, we are all infatuated with what's new and shiny. So me and one or two of the other people that were working with me on shoes finished porting it to Ruby 1.9.1. Now, here's the problem. Ruby 1.9.1 was terrible, right? Like, I don't know for those of you who used it, but it was actually categorized as a development release. Like, Ruby 1.9.1 was never intended for production. I only say it's terrible because of all the things I'm about to tell you in a minute, but like, it was not intended for me to do it that way. I didn't know any better because I was still relatively new to Ruby. The real problem, though, was that because, again, shoes is written with thousands of lines of uncommented C code, once it got to Ruby 1.9.1 and then Ruby 1.9.2 came out, I couldn't actually get it to work with Ruby 1.9.2. So I spent a year actually trying to port it to Ruby 1.9.2 and could not get it to work. To the point where when Ruby 1.9.3 came out, I tried for, again, almost a year to port it to Ruby 1.9.3, and that didn't work either. And then finally said, okay, we need to have a talk. Now here's the real problem of why it was really important to get away from Ruby 1.9.1. One of the things that was really, really bad about Ruby 1.9.1 was that the new threading stuff was just not fully baked yet. And then there's remember I said earlier about Windows Vista? So on about 30% of the shoes installations on Windows Vista, of course not one of mine, but on other people's 30% of machines of Windows Vista, the threading that's used in shoes just deadlocks and breaks and dies. And so it's really unfortunate when you've built Hackety Hack, a way for people to learn programming, and people that are learning programming often have Windows machines, and then they install it, and they get to learn that programming consists of programs crashing every 10 or 15 minutes. So it was important that we broke away. So what I'm here to tell you is that shoes is not dead. If you've been following the development of shoes, I've been sort of quiet about it for a while, but we decided that we would rather let Charlie Nutter deal with the cross-platform issues and not have to deal with it ourselves. So we are actually completely writing shoes in JRuby, and it is almost done and sort of kind of working already, and I'm about to show you some stuff with it today. So if you're interested in desktop applications, check out some shoes. Now, I'm not going to go into this is all right. We'll do a teeny little bit of shoes. Let me get to the correct terminal. All right, here. So I'll do this one. I use ChoRuby nowadays to switch rubies. It's pretty awesome. If you don't use it, it's pretty cool. So, all right, let's check out a shoes.rb file. This is also part of the irresponsibleness, is that coding live always goes wrong. So I decided it would be fun to do it in front of all of you because, that's the whole point, is being irresponsible. So it's fun. All right, so to make an application in shoes, you do shoes.app do end. That's it. And then if you run, I'm going to need a /. Let's see how this goes. If you run, it's not actually in this one. Oh, that's right, because it's, See, I told you, it always goes wrong. It doesn't matter. Source shoes 4, bin shoes %. This should work. And then we have the amazing, nope, see, didn't work there either. Why is, because it doesn't actually do that from Ruby. Okay, whatever. I will show you some shoes apps that do work that I ran before I decided to live code them. But the point is that shoes.app do end gives you a window with an application on it. And then the great thing I love about shoes is that it uses Ruby's blocks to great effect. So To make a button that you click, you type button, and then you say push me. Also, I'm really bad at Vim, by the way. So this button will come up and it'll say push me, and then the block runs when the button is pushed. So you can get an alert. Good job. All right, I'm going to try one more time to actually get this to work the right way, and I'm going to do this by doing this. Shoes 4. There's some weird stuff with the paths. Again, we're in development, so like, who knows? In shoes, temp shoes.rb. Hey, that looks like that might actually be working. So after the wonderful JVM startup time, you get a window that says push me, and you push the button, and it says good job. And that's it. Yes, it worked. Now, if you've ever done desktop, has anyone actually who's done desktop application stuff before? Okay, so you know how terribly, horribly, painfully, terribly horrible that is. And so when I saw this, I was like, oh my God, a desktop GUI toolkit that does not make me want to cry. This is amazing. I actually implemented, so here's another fun little thing in shoes. If you want to set a background, you can do something like this. Background, and then you can give it a range. So %000 to %, or not percent, you know what I mean. Hash FFF, and this will actually give us a gradient background. I'm just not even going to run it from inside of Vim because apparently I messed with my paths. It's probably, no, I don't want to even speculate. So this gives us this nice, awesome gradient background. When we were evaluating different options to rewrite shoes in, one of the things that we talked about was Qt. And because Qt works on all the platforms. So I started implementing stuff in Qt, and I was like, all right, I'll implement the background thing. So implementing that, like using a background that's a gradient, involves creating a gradient object, creating a pen object, creating 2 color objects, telling the gradient object how many types of colors it's going to gradient through and what percentage they all go down from, assigning those pen objects to those color objects and assigning the colored pen objects to the gradient object, and then inserting it into the run loop and then making it work. And this was like in the Ruby port of Qt. So it was like super intense. And so I was like, man, this is what it's like normally to build these desktop apps. No wonder everyone wants to use the web. Like, as much as we complain about JavaScript, like writing some C++ to use Qt is like, I would much rather code in JavaScript as much as I dislike it than have to do that. So this is what I really love about this, is it's really super simple. And also, this feeds into, so Hackney's mission is sort of like to teach people programming, and people's expectations are so much higher nowadays that we need a simple way to produce graphical applications so that people get excited. Because when I was a kid, I've been teaching high school kids for the last 2 weeks, and it's never made me feel so old. Like, I'm 27, and basically I'm always like, back when I was in high school, and then I was like, did I seriously just say that? Fuck. So back when I was in school and I was a little programmer kid, younger than you, we played Adventure on our terminals, and we liked it. And that was like how I learned programming, was through text adventures, and that was what I was really psyched about, and that's why I was here. The problem is you get a kid that's playing like Call of Duty, and you tell him like, listen, programming is super awesome. You can type punch the pirate in the face, and it'll say you died, idiot. Like. It's almost kind of like the voice chat on Call of Duty, actually, with less cussing. But the point is that people have higher expectations nowadays, and so it's important that we like do graphical stuff. It's so funny. So when I'm teaching these high school kids, they're like, oh yeah, Ruby programming, it's kind of fun. And I showed them a little bit of HTML and CSS, and I literally like made an H1 with a neon green background and made it this garish red colored like on the main body of the page. And they were like super psyched all of a sudden. And they're like, wait, I can make Ruby make this stuff? Oh, whoa, hold on. And they just got like really excited. So graphics like really speaks to people. Anyway, I need to stop talking about shoes because I'm gonna run out of some time. So that's sort of shoes. Now, let's talk about functional reactive programming. I'm just going to drop shoes for a while and come back to it later. Let's talk about functional reactive programming. Does anyone here know functional reactive programming? Yeah, one guy. This is 2 people. This is awesome. Okay, so functional reactive programming is this really, really interesting programming paradigm that sort of came out of this guy Conal Elliott's graduate work. It was sort of invented in Haskell for different reasons. Basically combines two different paradigms into one awesome paradigm, functional programming and reactive programming. So let's go over that real quick first. So functional programming is, as you probably know, functions as a first-class concept, which is not going to satisfy any of the pedantic people who love functional programming in terms of a definition, but whatever, this is a talk, it's my talk, I can say what I want. This is fine for now. It's cool. I've written Haskell before. I almost got a Haskell tattoo. I can like skim over details. It's cool. So I have a Ruby tattoo, by the way. That's how much. Me and Schneems always argue about who likes Ruby more, because I'm like, I have a Ruby tattoo, and he's like, I married a woman named Ruby. So anyway, so functions is a first-class concept and is a way of doing this kind of programming stuff. So we all do this. Ruby is sort of functionally inflected, and we enjoy it and doing it. So I don't need to talk about it anymore. Reactive programming, though, is something we don't necessarily do a lot of, and that is data flows as a first-class concept. What is a data flow, Steve? I'm glad you asked. But before I tell you that, basically functional reactive programming is using first-class functions to manipulate flows of data. So you can think of these data flows as like Excel, right? So if you do programming in Excel, and people do programming in Excel, I actually like to think that the banking crisis was caused by Excel, not by anything else. When I had a startup back in the day, my co-founder actually wanted to learn Python so that he could write a syntax highlighting plugin for gedit that would highlight his Excel macros. And I was like, I'm not helping you learn programming anymore. Sorry. So in Excel, when you're writing your application to manage thousands of houses that are going to be underwater and make people homeless, you decide to link up like column 1A plus column 1B equals families on the street. No, equals C. And then that changes. So when you modify the fact that you're making way more money on one column, it updates things automatically. Sorry, that was going to get nothing political in this talk, and it just came out. I was trying to hold it down. So the point is that you link these things up, and then when you change the inputs, the outputs change automatically. This is what I mean by flow. Data flows through your program. It's not imperative in the way that we say things. Data flows? So this is Ruby code, right? A equals 5, B equals A plus 6. B is 11. If you change A to 6, B is still 11, right? This is easy. This makes sense. This is not the way that functional reactive programming works. In functional reactive programming, and I'm using the colon just to differentiate it because, it's different, A would be equal to 5, B would be sort of, and it's better rather than to say equals, it's like bound to the expression of is sort of the language. So B is bound to the value of A plus 6. So B is currently 11. But whenever I go to A and I set it to 6, B becomes 12. So this is sort of a little bit different than what we're used to doing, and I think in many ways much more interesting. Not necessarily more. So here's the big words that Conal likes to use in his papers, and you can go read those papers if it interests you. But basically there's like three main concepts in FRP. So there's a time-varying value, which is called like a behavior. So that's what A and B would be. They vary over time. Events are things that occur many times over a certain period of time. And then switching is like the ability for time-varying values to react to events. I'm not going to use any of those big words anymore because they're silly. I'm going to talk to you about a slightly easier wording than I use in Frappuccino. But before I talk to you about Frappuccino, I want to talk to you about my friend Philip. So I think that it's really important that we go and explore things. Again, this irresponsibleness is also about exploration. So I think it's really important that we go and explore other programming paradigms and topics. This is one of the reasons why I was interested in FRP, is that I didn't know anybody who did it in Ruby. But I went to this JavaScript conference called the Real-Time Conference EU 2013. It was super cool. Philip gave a talk there that was really awesome called Enemy of the State, Functional Reactive Programming with Bacon.js, and you should totally watch it sometime. But he decided to present about Bacon.js, which is a functional reactive programming library in JavaScript for writing UI stuff, and I was like, whoa, this is really neat. We should totally have this in Ruby. So I sort of stopped paying attention to his talk for a minute and busted out bundle gem, and I was like, oh, I gotta think of a name. I can't write a gem without a name, and I was like, FRP Frappuccino? So like, I was like, that's where Frappuccino comes from, because functional reactive programming, and I drink a lot of coffee, turns into Frappuccino. So literally during the rest of his talk, I started like stealing the UI or the interface like elements to make this work, and then ended up like writing a Ruby gem over the rest of the conference to sort of be similar to bacon.js. So that is the complex heritage of this Ruby gem, is that it comes from bacon.js, which comes from like RxJX, which comes from Elm, which comes from Haskell stuff. Now let's talk about Frappuccino real quick. And same deal. All right, I'm going to go into the other terminal, which has Ruby 2 instead of, no, does it all have JRuby? Whatever, I'll switch into the right one. It's Ruby 2, switch into Ruby 2.0. Okay, so let's talk about Frappuccino real quick. So, oh hey, look, I already have this example from the last time I gave this talk because I totally forgot to delete it. First of all, we need to, in order to do this, we need to require Frappuccino. Of course, it's a Ruby gem, you require it. Then, in this case, I'm going to be pushing a button. That's going to be like the thing that changes. And so I'm going to make a class called button with a method called push. And then what the button is going to do is whenever the button is pushed, it's going to emit an event, which is a symbol called plus. So this button like adds 1. Now, you may be wondering where emit came from. This is my irresponsibleness. We'll talk about that later, or maybe you'll have to source dive, but it works. So we call this method called emit, which doesn't exist anywhere. And then what we do is we make a button. I'm going to scroll this down here. So we make a button by button.new, and then we create a Frappuccino stream out of that button. So what the stream does is the stream collects up all of the events that occur and allows you to do processing on them. This is the functional part. So the reactive part is the things flowing through the stream, and the functional part is this map and inject. So we make this stream, and then well, actually, I guess we technically make the whole stream and then assign it to the stream variable, but whatever. The point is we make the stream, and then we call map on the stream. Map is just from enumerable. It's the exact same enumerable thing that you know of. We get events, and then just for maximum unreadability, because it's functional programming, I decided to use the ternary operator instead of an if. So we get an event, and we say if the event is a plus, map it to 1, otherwise map it to a 0. In this case, we know that all of the events are going to be 1s, but I just wanted to make the logic, be there. So I made it so that it could theoretically take other events, but this should only ever get pluses. So we map those events into 1s and 0s, and then we call inject to sum them up. And then that stream, I didn't actually assign, yeah, okay, I actually modified this code, will not totally work because this actually would not longer be a stream, it would be a total. Because since I was showing off some formatting stuff, now my terminal's too low, okay. So we would assign this to a total, right, because we're injecting to a sum, right? So then we can puts total.now, and that should be 0, and then when we push the button 3 times, and then puts total.now, it should be 3, right? So let's see if this works properly. It should. Yeah! Totally almost live coding, but not quite. 0 and then 3. So this is sort of the basics of how this works in Ruby. Okay, so then I was thinking about this, and the problem was, so I wrote this gem. It's a copy of bacon.js, but like I still had no idea how it would actually be useful to anyone. I was just like, this thing seems kind of cool. And so one of the things in the ways that I think that it could be possibly useful to us as Rubyists is building desktop applications in shoes. Because bacon.js is useful for building GUI applications in the browser. So I was like, oh, GUI applications outside of the browser. So I'm going to show you this other thing, which again, I just cannot get into the right terminal whatsoever. There's a shoes application that looks like this. Let's see here. It is reference.rb. So this is a very simple shoes application, and what it does is it sets up a background color, and then you get a button with +1, and you increment a count. So when the button is pushed, we increment a count instance variable, and then we replace the value of this label with the current count. Then we have a -1 button where we decrement the same count variable, and we replace it with the current count. then we set our instance variable to 0, and we set the label equal to a paragraph that prints out the count, which initially, of course, is 0. So when I press the buttons, it will add stuff together and print this out. So this is like the way you would write a shoes application now. There's some stuff about shoes you didn't see yet, but like whatever, instance variables to reference stuff, do blocks. I think it's relatively viewable. So, of course, because this is a conference talk, I'm going to take this incredibly simple, relatively clear Ruby code and make it more complicated by recommending a design pattern. But if your application was bigger than this, I think Frappuccino could be useful, and like Hackety, for example, is a couple thousand lines of this kind of stuff. So when you have all these complicated, like these instance variables manipulated all over the place, right? We assign it in one spot, and then we actually edit the count in 2 places, and we edit the label in 2 places. So this is like the perfect example for functional active programming. I want to bind the result of the label to be the outcome of whatever the total is, right? That's actually my logic. We've split up the business logic here into a bunch of different places, and it doesn't actually represent what it is we do, right? We always say in Ruby that we don't write comments because our code just says what we want it to do, but this does not actually say what we want it to do. So if you look at the FRP version of this, using Frappuccino, I made a button which takes an event of some kind. This is just so I could use plus and minus buttons the same, and we just emit that event when they get pushed. And then I make a plus button with the button.new plus and a minus button with the button.new minus. I make a stream out of the both of them, and then I made a convenient, since I found that when I was writing code in this way, I would always end up using map with an if. So I just wrote this thing lets you take hashes with keys and values, so it maps events to other stuff. So this would map a plus event to a 1, a minus event to another 1, and then anything else to a 0. And then we sum it up. And now the button just says that, hey, when the +1 button gets pushed in the in the UI, I'm not that far advanced yet. You push the plus button, and when the -1 button gets pushed, you push the minus button. And then the label, I had to do some hackery. I'm coming with some better integration for this, but animate is basically a loop that runs all the time. So I basically just every half second or so replace the current count, the label with the value of whatever the outcome of the counter is now. So now this says exactly what I mean. Please continually update the label with this value, push those buttons when they get pushed, and because apparently I'm still going to do this all the time, I will run this to show you that it works. And now we get our little +1, -1s, and we can hit the button and it updates. So I know this is obviously a super useful application that you are all going to go steal the source code to immediately. Let me show you another one that is very similar to that one. So actually, I'm going to do this first. I'm going to show you the code as it runs actually, rather than before I show you the code itself. Samples and circle. So there's this other little example that I've showed where it's a little more complicated, where you have multiple event kinds going on. So here is this little circle. When you hit start, it starts animating up and down in an oscillation, and it also prints started to my console. And then when you hit stop, it stops. Start, stop. Pretty simple. But if we check out the code for this, basically we have a clock that keeps track of the current count, and we have a reference to, we pass it our application, and it keeps a reference to that application around, and it starts off with the clock being off. And then when you press the start button on the clock, it sets up an animation where it emits events of I, which is the current number of seconds that have occurred while the animation is running. If the clock is on, we also emit a started event that's a string, and then set the instance variable on to true. And then in the stop, we basically emit a stopped event, and we set on to false. Then in the actual shoes application, we make a clock, we set up a Frappuccino stream out of that clock, and then we make 2 different streams out of that stream. So I use select, which again is your normal enumerable select, and this time for sake of ease, I decided to just say if it's a fixed num, then we want to keep track of this as ticks. And then I have this actual, this is another Frappuccino feature I did not show you called onValue, where basically every time a new event gets processed through the stream, run this callback. So I could have done the animate version in this way if I wanted to too. This is sort of what I was working on the details, but basically, when we get a new tick event, move the circle in this math pattern that makes some oscillation happen. And then there's a start-stop event that grabs all of these string events out of the same stream. So this is built on the original one, so we've sort of split the stream into two different things, and then just print it out to the console, and that's it. And then the start button and the stop button just start and stop the clock. Now, what's interesting about this is that this shows how you can like grab streams and then like copy them to make other streams. So this is one of the things that makes FRP a really interesting solution, is that basically it's trivial to add extra functionality because you can leave all the older stuff alone and sort of grab the pieces of the stream that you find interesting. So if we wanted to add a new button to our UI, we could add the new button and then maybe grab events from it, if that's possible, or from the clock. Like if we wanted to respond to the clock in some other way, we wouldn't actually need to change any of this code. We'd just be grabbing something else from the initial stream, and that can be really useful in different times. But that's getting way too serious for this whole point. So I'm just going to go back to this. So circle example. So Frappuccino in general is the most irresponsible Ruby code that I've written lately. Again, I just sort of made a gem on a whim, and I didn't know how it would be useful, and decided to just like kind of put it out there for funsies. And so, as you know, as I said before, I mentioned that the emit method is not defined anymore. So how does that work? LOL. I don't have time to tell you, so you can look at the code or think about it yourself and see if you can figure it out. I gave this talk with Matt's in the audience, and then I had to give it away before I could find. I was curious if he would be able to guess what I did, because it's not that complicated. But like when I figured it out, I was like, oh man, this is awesome. But it's kind of also really bizarre. So not really, really bizarre, but like kind of bizarre. So I think that Frappuccino, as I said before about tests, Frappuccino has a full acceptance test suite. So I make sure I don't break my old features when I build new stuff. But it is not TDD'd whatsoever, because I felt that that would guide me towards a certain way of building it, and this is about fun and interesting stuff more than like mega productive stuff. So this is my message to you and what I wish that you take away from what I'm here to say to you today. Please go forth and be irresponsible. Do creative stuff and build fun things in Ruby. Do things that you might consider to be bad to see if you get interesting outcomes from them. And I wish that let's have a lot more fun with Ruby these days, all right? Thanks.
Thank you, Steve.